This is SG2 Perspectives, a conversation with SG2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
It's important to understand when we're scenario planning that we're responding to something that is external to our organization. That's why we like to call it environmental scenario planning. This is something that's happening out there that we don't have any control over, that we need to formulate a response to. That's the biggest one that a lot of our health system members have trouble with.
Welcome to SG2 Perspectives. I am your host for today's episode, Jayme Zage. I'm excited to have two of my colleagues here with me, Janelle Kwan and Tony Guth. We are going to talk scenario planning. One of the reasons why scenario planning is so important is it helps us manage some of this uncertainty that we've been dealing with. To be able to move beyond planning for those different potential outcomes that we might need to react to or that might need to try to drive towards. Janelle and Tony, let's talk about that why now, why it's so important to do it now. Uncertainty versus unknowns. What do you think, Janelle?
We live in a period where we have, relative to a few months ago, some certainty on a few areas that impact health system, but there are a number of outstanding questions related to kind of broader economic environment, policy. And Tony and I, when we work with organizations, find when there are a lot of those unknowns or what feels like unanswerable questions, the natural instinct is to dig into addressing near-term tactical issues. Scenario planning is the right time now because it helps us to figure out long-term what might be happening and how can we help future-proof or insulate ourselves to be prepared. Tony, you've worked with a lot of members over the years with different hats, navigating a world where they need scenario planning.
The importance of environmental scenario planning is that it tries to mitigate the risk of a bunch of different futures. The fact that this year we've come across so many challenging obstacles as a health industry has introduced a lot of different futures that people maybe weren't planning for in the very recent past, as recently as last year. That's why it's important now. Environmental scenario planning is going to help leaders understand what's worth planning for, what's likely, and what's worth their time in plugging into their strategic plan.
We've seen in the more recent history a lot of strategic planning departments actually doing sensitivity planning. How is environmental scenario planning different than sensitivity planning?
Scenario planning is different than sensitivity analysis. So sensitivity analysis is more or less like rejiggering some inputs to figure out a different outcome of a certain known thing. A recent one we've done, some team had done internally at SG2, we were trying to figure out what would be the impact of Medicaid cuts if there were 10% fewer covered lives versus 15 versus 20% fewer covered lives in a particular market. That's sensitivity analysis. They're just different versions of the same scenario. And it's very valuable because scenarios, by definition, these future scenarios are unknown. And it's nice to have different sensitivities of those scenarios. So that's what sensitivity analysis is you're just moving it a little bit up, a little bit down, trying to figure out the range of the impact. Whereas the scenario planning process is bigger and broader and more strategic than that. Like, what is the actual scenario that we're planning for? And in that example, the scenario would be the state responds in a certain way that has an effect on Medicaid coverage in our market. Then you'd move on to the next scenario, which could be entirely different with impact. Even that scenario, the next scenario might have its own sensitivity analysis within that. That's the key difference, Jayme.
I would add to that time horizon. Sensitivity analyses tend to be more in the short and midterm, where scenario planning is more anchored in a long-term lens. And to echo Tony, some of those larger macro forces at play and what might be some of those implications.
And so you've mentioned these different environmental impacts that might be coming. We could look at something as simple as what happens if EMS goes on strike. Or we could look at disaster planning as environmental scenario planning as well. How do you make a determination of what are the scenarios that really need to take a look at and plan for in that longer term?
We have kind of a handful of guideposts or parameters that can help you to distinguish what is a scenario that you need to further explore. And we're at SG2.
It was a team effort to come up with an acronym, but Rebecca was the EDICT.
The larger thing that EDICT speaks to is one, they're external. They're these larger macro forces beyond the health system. They're distinct. So it is a concrete, specific thing, and there's impact. It could measure whether that's financially, operationally, workforce lens. Should it come to be meaningfully impact the health system and its ability to run? it's credible. In the level of reasonability of something to happen, there's a credible reality that this scenario could come to be, and it's timely. Lots of debate and timeline would say it could happen within the 1 to 5 years. But I think when we found working with members, having that sort of delineation can help them make sense of all the noise and things happening and what are these true scenarios that could impact our health system that we need to think through and consider.
That EDICT acronym is really helpful. The most, if I were to pick my favorite component of that, it would be the external component of EDICT. It's important to understand when we're scenario planning that we're responding to something that is external to our organization. That's why we like to call it environmental scenario planning. This is something that's happening out there that we don't have any control over, that we need to formulate a response to. That's the biggest one that a lot of our health system members have trouble with. In some of the consulting work I've done, we think through scenarios, and they're not always environmental. Sometimes the scenario is, okay, so what's going to happen when we build this hospital the next town over? It's like, no, let's take a step back. That's not a scenario. That's a response to something. It's a choice that we've made. That's not an environmental scenario that we need to respond to. I think that's probably the most important component. And it's so important that we put in the name. It's environmental scenario planning. It's happening to us. How do we react? Let's develop a plan.
It forces you, to your point, Tony, to look outside the walls and of your market and to translate these larger cultural national trends and what that might mean to still for the health system in its day to day.
No, I think it's really important and goes back to the real key component of strategic planning. And we use the play to win strategy a lot, but that idea of making a choice. And if you understand what those scenarios are and can start to think about what choices you might make as a way to respond to those, and that helps you then in the moment when things do start to happen, you've already been through the process of thinking through those choices. We've dabbled a little bit around examples, but Tony, let's start with you. What are some examples of scenario planning that you've been involved in or that you think would be good to help solidify this concept with our listeners today?
It was a pretty common consulting project for me when I was on our consulting team at SG2 years ago. The most common situation with these clients would be we need to work with our leadership team or our board to understand what's happening in the healthcare industry, how is it happening in our market locally, and what are we going to do about it? Who do we want to be in this future that's shaping up? So it's a really good use of executives and board members' time and trying to figure out what the health system is supposed to be when it grows up, so to speak. That's probably the most common approach that we took in consulting. That was like our core audience. It's where it was most valuable. But the really valuable part and what was a good outcome in any project that I did with environmental scenario planning as the tool was we had a deliverable that was safe, mitigated risks against unknowns. The fact that we've developed a plan for 8, 10, 12 scenarios. There was a project where we walked through 20 scenarios. They just wanted to plan for everything. They were ambitious. The fact that we had a response for that many scenarios, we had a really good idea of what we wanted to do. The majority of those scenarios. And that's the real value of scenario planning. It's not necessarily that we've got a plan for 20 different futures. Let's just pull out the portfolio for the future once it comes true and then we know what to do. That's not what scenario planning is. You develop a strategic approach for each one of these scenarios and then you find the common themes across those approaches. So for that client that had 20 scenarios, for example, in 15 of those scenarios, it made sense to partner with an orthopedic group in the market to do a joint venture on an ASC. If that's the path forward in 15 of the 20 scenarios, then that's a safe path forward. That's mitigating risk. You don't have to know the future to know that if it makes sense that many times, then that's the right thing to do. That's in our strategic plan now. So it mitigates the risk and it frees us up from the burden of trying to predict the future, because that's what strategic planning is. Kind of a silly task if you think about it, where we're asked to sit in a room and try and predict the future. And the goofy thing is that we actually try and do it. What this does is it frees us up from doing that. We don't have to predict the future. We can anticipate many, many different futures, develop a plan for each one, find the common threads, and know that that plan that we've developed as an aggregate of all those different scenario responses is a safe path forward.
I found that when we work with organizations who go through this work, the contending with multiple futures, but it also arriving at it as being like a foundation for solid strategy. And it helps hit on two areas that health systems struggle frequently with: prioritization, where do we need to direct efforts, and also differentiation, because they're doing the work of looking across futures and finding common themes that transcend or span some of those different futures.
So you said 20 was a lot of scenarios to plan for, Tony. What's an ideal portfolio of scenarios to consider in a strategic planning process?
There's no true good number. The problem is that when you get to a high number of scenarios that you've planned for, you start to challenge one component of the EDICT acronym, which is distinct. The scenarios start to sound very similar after a while, at least in their impacts. Of those 20 scenarios, I guarantee you 8, 9, 10 of them probably just reduced revenue in a different way. It's getting a bit redundant. We need distinct scenarios that affect our organization in distinct ways. The risk there in doing too many is that they're no longer distinct. So I was having fun on those projects like 12, 13, 14 was usually the sweet spot, I thought.
Tony, I feel like when you work with members, one of the areas when they're going through scenario planning is trying to understand impact. It seems to be a place where they often don't know how to go about doing that. What are kind of parameters or guidelines when you work with members to help figure out what that impact might be?
This is where a lot of the hard work comes into play. So it's fun to think of the scenarios. And to your point, Janelle, it's harder to think of a way to capture the impact that those scenarios have and what our response is. What we think is a good idea as we're putting together this course for our members, we're trying to present a structured approach. It's going to be a little different for every health system as they go through this exercise, but you need to find the handful of levers, the handful of things that you have control over that you want to use to respond to the scenario. Those same exact levers are going to be the things against which you measure like the impact. If one of your levers is your capital planning process, then let's measure the financial impact. If one of your levers is how you align with physicians or who you hire in this particular ambulatory hub facility, then workforce is probably another good lever. And if you want to figure out the impact on how we deliver care, which side of care is suddenly important when it wasn't before, that's another important lever. It's about finding the handful. It ranged in the practical work we did. Sometimes there were 5 levers, really simple. Sometimes there were 10 or a dozen. But what are the things that are most meaningful to the client, to the health system, that they have control over and that will get affected by the scenarios? And so what we're doing in the course is we're focusing on a handful of those.
That's probably great in terms of thinking how you get to meaningful impacts. That's where the credibility part comes in too. That's an important component of making sure you get to those meaningful impacts that you can, one, measure, but two, that are relevant for how you're going to make your decision. We've talked a lot about what scenario planning is, how you get to good scenarios. How do you use it as part of your strategic planning process? Is it a pressure test for your strategic goals, or what's the most effective way to leverage this type of work effort in developing a resilient strategic plan? Janelle, maybe let's start with you.
There's more than one way you can use it in terms of where it fits in to broader strategic planning. Certainly, we've seen this used a lot. Organizations will use it as the kickstart to strategy formulation because the analysis of the different futures helps point them where some of those priorities are in the kind of pressure test, gut checking. We've also seen organizations use that as a way to reflect from some of those learnings and how does that align with the organizations if they've already had their strategic plan or the strategic priorities that they've outlined. Do they contradict each other? Does the environmental scenario planning unearth maybe blind spots that are not accounted for in the strategic plan? But Tony, anything else I might be missing?
I couldn't have said it better. Environmental scenario planning works as like a novo part of a process. Like if you're kicking off a new 5-year strategic plan, for example, it's a phenomenal way to get that started. But if you already have a process in place, you're in the middle of 5-year strategic plan, it is a really good pressure testing device. Go through the planning process, the scenario planning process, and figure out what your current strategic plan might not be accounting for. Yeah, I think it works in both ways.
Words of wisdom that you would offer to those who want to try environmental strategic planning?
My advice would be not to default to doom and gloom scenarios. You got to plan for windfalls too, like some philanthropy that you didn't expect. Maybe the state decides to do something in your favor. Maybe a competitor does something that advantages you. You need a good spread. That's something we didn't talk about when we were picking scenarios. You need a good spread of scenarios of good and bad and national and local or regional. I think those are my parting words of wisdom. Make sure you got a good spread and you're diversifying the scenarios that you're planning for.
Our natural instinct is what's the problem I have to solve? But this is also a process to figure out what might the world look like and how do we want to be or play within that future world. It's kind of a muscle that you develop and it is something you have to be methodical about. Tony talked earlier about often the biggest lift comes in the impact section, trying to figure out what it might mean. this new reality, setting in place kind of the structures and systems to be able to go through that are ways that we've seen organizations be able to advance strategy and their larger vision by using environmental scenario planning.
Well, thank you, Tony and Janelle, for sharing your insights and giving a little preview of the learnings that'll come from the new course that we've developed at SG2 on environmental scenario planning. It's really interesting to think about how you can create some certainty, resiliency, and mitigate risk in your strategic plans and achieving your strategic goals. So thank you for sharing your expertise with our listeners today. And thank you to our listeners for listening in on this episode of SG2 Perspectives.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and/or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at SG2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, SG2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You could find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.